Welcome to the Tank Guide Life podcast. When we normally talk about diagnosing a problem, like, say, in medicine or fixing a car, there's this comforting expectation of just, absolute precision.
Right, yeah, like it's a binary thing.
Exactly. You break an arm, you get an x-ray, the doctor points to the jagged white line and says, yep, it's broken. It's either broken or it isn't. But the moment you step into the world of planted aquariums, that kind of diagnostic precision just completely shatters.
Well, absolutely. It's totally gone.
Because we're no longer looking at a single isolated variable, We're looking at a landscape that is incredibly dynamic and honestly just deeply complex.
It really forces a completely different cognitive approach. I mean, we are so conditioned by modern convenience to just look for linear solutions.
Right. The quick fix.
Yeah. If a light bulb goes out, you screw in a new one. If you have a headache, you take a pill. So when an aquarist looks at their tank and sees something going wrong, their immediate biological imperative is to just find the single tangible product that's going to reverse the damage.
And I really want to paint this picture for you listening, because if you're in this hobby, you have lived this exact scenario. You go to your local fish store, or maybe you order online, and you acquire these absolutely stunning, vibrant, aquatic plants.
Oh yeah, they look perfect at the store.
Right. They have that perfect, crisp, structural integrity. You bring them home, you carefully place them in your newly flooded aquarium, and for about, 5 to 7 days, it is pure bliss.
It's a honeymoon phase.
It is. It's the underwater paradise you envisioned. But then the system begins to process its new reality. You wake up on day 12, and those once crisp leaves are turning into this translucent, disintegrating mush. Or you notice the rocks are suddenly blanketed in a suffocating web of algae.
And that is the exact inflection point where most hobbyists make a critical, albeit entirely understandable, error.
Yeah.
The immediate instinct is to look at a melting plant and just assume starvation. It's a terrestrial bias, really. If your tomato plant droops in the garden, what do? You water it and add some miracle grow.
Right, you feed it.
Exactly. So in the aquarium, the hobbyist rushes out to buy the most expensive, highly concentrated bottle of liquid fertilizer they can find, assuming they just need to inject life-saving nutrition into the water.
But pouring liquid fertilizer into an imbalanced, struggling tank is essentially, it's like pouring high-octane racing fuel into a car that currently has no spark plugs and flat tires.
That is a great analogy. Doesn't make it go faster.
No. It just creates a highly volatile hazard. And that brings us to the core mission of this deep dive. Today, we are tearing down the foundational mechanisms of planted tanks, focusing specifically on substrates, fertilizers, and how nutrients actually move through this environment.
Because at FishKeepingLifeCo, our core philosophy, the mantra we really want etched into your brain, is this: it's not your fertilizer, it's your system.
It's your system. I'm so glad we're centering the conversation on that. It's like baking, Beginners are always looking for a magical frosting those liquid fertilizers to fix a cake that just has a terrible batter.
Yeah, if the batter is bad, the cake is bad. Frosting won't save it.
Exactly. And the batter is the substrate and the overall system balance. So if you continue to view your aquarium as merely a glass box filled with water where you arbitrarily drop in plants and chemicals, you're going to be fighting a losing battle against biology.
We have to fundamentally shift that paradigm. The aquarium is a closed, living ecosystem. Every granular piece of soil, every microscopic water parameter, and every living organism is engaged in this continuous biochemical dialogue.
And the ground floor of that dialogue, literally and figuratively, is the substrate. So let's dive right into that ground floor. Because when I first entered the hobby, I looked at gravel and sand through a purely aesthetic lens.
Most people do.
Yeah, I just thought it was decorative dead weight. Its entire purpose, in my mind, was to provide friction so the plants didn't just spontaneously float to the surface and clog my filter intake.
Right, which is the baseline assumption for almost everyone. But treating substrate as just inert decorative weight is like, it's like looking at the foundation of a skyscraper and assuming it's just there to make the basement look nice.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The substrate is the biological, chemical, and structural engine of the entire tank. I mean, yes, it obviously provides the mechanical anchoring for root systems, but its true power lies in its microscopic topography.
So we're talking about surface area.
Massive surface area. It provides a staggering amount of space for heterotrophic and autotrophic bacteria to colonize. It constantly interacts with and often actively alters the water chemistry above it. And most vitally for the plants, it acts as a highly regulated nutrient reservoir.
I want to double click on that term for a second, nutrient reservoir, because I think there is this pervasive myth that planting a root into nutrient-rich soil is like hooking an IV line directly into the plant's veins, just force-feeding it 24/7.
That is a brilliant way to phrase the misconception. Soil does not force-feed a plant. It's not an active pump. It is much more accurate to view the substrate as a highly organized, securely locked pantry.
The locked pantry. Okay.
Yeah. When you utilize a quality substrate, the nutrients, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the trace minerals, they're bound to the soil particles. The plant roots have to actively grow into that matrix, interface with the soil, and deliberately extract what they need, precisely when their metabolic processes demand it.
Wait, so if the substrate is just a storage unit, does that mean plants are essentially just pantry grazers taking a little bit over months rather than eating 3 square meals a day?
Exactly. And to understand how they do that, we have to look at the actual physics and chemistry of the soil, specifically something called cation exchange capacity, or CEC.
Okay, CEC. Let's break that down for folks who might be a bit rusty on their soil chemistry.
Sure. So CEC is essentially a measure of how many positively charged nutrient ions like calcium, magnesium, or potassium a specific substrate can hold on to.
So think of a high CEC substrate like clay as a massive, powerful magnetic sponge.
That magnetic sponge analogy is perfect.
Yeah.
The clay particles in the substrate carry a negative electrical charge. Because opposites attract, they pull in and hold on to those positively charged nutrient cations.
Right.
They grip them tightly enough that the water current in your tank doesn't just wash them away, but loosely enough that a plant root can come along and steal them.
And the way the root steals them is just fascinating. The plant essentially uses currency. When a root needs, say, potassium, it secretes a positively charged hydrogen ion into the soil.
Yep. It initiates a trade.
It trades that hydrogen ion to the magnetic sponge in exchange for the potassium ion it actually wants. It is a highly localized, deliberate, and entirely active biological transaction.
Which fundamentally changes how we view stability in the aquarium. Because the plant is controlling the transaction rate, you don't end up with dangerous, sudden spikes of nutrients free-floating in the water column.
And if they were free-floating, that would be bad news, right?
Oh, terrible news. If those nutrients weren't bound to the CEC of the substrate, if they were just dumped freely into the water, the concentration could reach toxic levels for the livestock. And more importantly, algae would exploit that free-floating buffet instantly.
Because algae doesn't have roots.
Exactly. Algae lacks complex root systems. It absorbs nutrients directly across its cellular membrane from the water. So by keeping the nutrients locked in the substrate's pantry, you give the rooted plants a massive competitive advantage over the algae.
But this introduces a fascinating dilemma when we compare our living room glass boxes to natural ecosystems. In the wild, say, a tributary in the Amazon basin or a slow-moving stream in Southeast Asia, that pantry is self-restocking.
Right. Nature does the work.
Yeah, you have continuous water flow bringing in dissolved minerals from miles upstream. You have decomposing leaf litter falling from the jungle canopy. You have topsoil washing in from the monsoon rains. The system is entirely open.
The wild ecosystem is characterized by infinite dilution and constant replenishment. But your aquarium is the exact opposite. It's a strictly closed system.
Meaning, whatever happens in the box stays in the box.
Exactly. The boundaries of your glass box dictate that whatever is inside will eventually be consumed, and whatever is produced will accumulate until you intervene. The nutrients stored in the substrate CEC will eventually be depleted by the active growth of the plants.
There's no monsoon rain bringing in fresh topsoil to our living rooms.
Thankfully, no. So the aquarist has to step into the role of the ecosystem's weather and geology.
Yeah.
You have to become the replenisher.
Which begs the obvious question, if we know the substrate is this critical transaction-based reservoir that we eventually have to manage, what physical material should you actually be putting at the bottom of the tank?
Yeah, this is a big decision.
Because the market presents us with an overwhelming paradox of choice. You walk into any high-end aquascaping shop and there are just pallets of premium bags, all claiming to be the absolute pinnacle of aquatic soil engineering.
It really boils down to two fundamentally different philosophies of tank management. On one side, you have the highly engineered, nutrient-dense commercial soils, and on the other, you have entirely inert, budget-friendly materials.
Let's dissect the engineered side first. The industry standard, the easy button for lush growth, is Aquasoil. We're talking about the premium products, 8A Aquasoil, Fluval Stratum, UNS Contrasoil, Tropica. What is the actual material science behind these little brown spheres?
Well, at their core, commercial aquasoils are essentially volcanic ash and nutrient-rich clays that have been mined, heavily supplemented with organic compounds and fertilizers, extruded into uniform pellets, and then baked or sintered at relatively low temperatures.
So they're physically shaped into those little balls.
Right. This manufacturing process creates a granule that holds its physical shape underwater, but it remains soft enough for delicate plant roots to easily penetrate and shatter.
And the CEC on these baked clay pellets is just off the charts, right? They're basically preloaded magnetic sponges packed to the absolute brim with nitrogen, phosphorus, and essential trace elements.
They are. The availability of those localized nutrients is why aquasoil is the undisputed gold standard for cultivating dense, demanding carpeting plants like HC cuba or dwarf hairgrass.
But the physical nutrient payload is only half the story, right?
Exactly. The other massive benefit of aquasoil is its active chemical buffering capacity.
Now, this is where a lot of people get tripped up. Aquasoil actively alters the parameters of your tap water. It doesn't just sit there.
Precisely. Most premium aquasoils contain high levels of humic and fulvic acids. When you submerge them, they actively pull carbonate hardness, your KH, out of the water column, binding it to the soil.
Okay.
By stripping the carbonates, the soil naturally drives the pH of the water down, usually buffering it to a slightly acidic range, anywhere from 6.0 to 6.8, depending on your source water.
And for anyone wondering why we care about making the water slightly acidic, you really have to look at the evolutionary history of the plants and fish we keep.
Right, where do they come from?
Yeah, the vast majority of the species popular in the hobby, your tetras, rasboras, epistogrammas, and almost all the stem plants, they evolved in tropical blackwater environments or rainforest streams, where decomposing organics make the water soft and acidic. We're basically chemically recreating their ancestral home.
And it goes even deeper than basic comfort. The pH of the water directly impacts nutrient bioavailability. In slightly acidic water, certain essential micronutrients, particularly iron, remain in a dissolved bioavailable state much longer.
Ah, so the plants can actually eat it.
Exactly. If the pH creeps up into the highly alkaline range, say 8.0 or above iron, rapidly oxidizes and precipitates out of the water, it becomes completely inaccessible to the plants no matter how much you dose.
Wow.
Furthermore, there's a fascinating physiological interaction with the livestock. Have you ever looked deeply into how pH affects fish respiration?
Are you talking about the Bohr effect? Because this blew my mind when I first read the literature on it.
Yes, the Bohr effect. It's a physiological phenomenon regarding how hemoglobin in the blood binds to oxygen. In slightly acidic environments, like the water created by aquasoil fish, hemoglobin actually has a reduced affinity for binding oxygen, which sounds bad at first.
Yeah, that sounds like they can't breathe.
But what it actually means is that the hemoglobin more readily releases oxygen into the fish's tissues. It makes their internal gas exchange highly efficient. So by using an active buffering substrate, you aren't just feeding plants, you are optimizing the cellular respiration of your tetras.
That is the epitome of ecosystem thinking. Everything is connected. But before we crown Aquasoil the flawless victor of the substrate wars, we really have to talk about the reality of the trade-offs, because it is not a perfect product.
Oh, definitely not.
First and foremost, there is the undeniable financial barrier.
The cost is exorbitant, especially if you're scaling up. If you're building a beautiful little 5-gallon nanocube for a single bed of fish on your desk, one $40 bag of premium aquasoil is a perfectly reasonable investment. But if you're setting up a standard 75-gallon or 120-gallon display tank in your living room, achieving a proper 3-inch substrate bed using exclusively premium aquasoil could easily cost you hundreds, if not over $1,000 just in dirt.
It's the dreaded aquarium tax. You put a picture of a neon tetra on a bag of dirt, and the price per pound quintuples.
It's painful.
But beyond the sheer cost, there is a biological hurdle with aquasoil that catches a lot of hobbyists off guard: the initial ammonia spike.
Yes. This is a critical management phase because aquasoils are packed with massive amounts of organic matter. The moment they are submerged, that organic material begins to undergo bacterial breakdown.
And the byproduct of that is ammonia.
Exactly. And not just a little bit of ammonia. We're talking about massive, dark, purple on the test kit levels of ammonia leaching into the water column for the first 3 to 6 weeks of the tank's life.
Which means if you just set up a tank with 80 Amazonia, fill it with water, and throw your expensive fish in on day 2, you are going to subject them to severe, lethal chemical burns. Ammonia toxicity just destroys their gill tissue.
It's devastating. Managing a new aquasoil tank requires intense vigilance. During that initial cycling phase, you're often doing 50% water changes every single day, or at least every other day, to physically remove the excess ammonia before it can trigger an insurmountable algae bloom while you wait for your biological filter to establish.
It is highly labor-intensive in the beginning.
Very much so.
And even after you survive the ammonia spike and your plants are thriving, we have to return to the concept of the closed system. That preloaded magnetic sponge isn't infinite. I like to think of Aquasoil as a high-value, preloaded gift card.
I love that comparison.
Yeah, it's amazing. It provides incredible purchasing power right out of the gate, and the plants go on an absolute spending spree. But whether it takes 18 months or 3 years, eventually the funds run out. The built-in nutrients are exhausted, the organic structure breaks down into a finer mud, and the active buffering capacity is completely neutralized.
At which point, your highly engineered, expensive soil effectively becomes inert. Which brings us perfectly to the other side of the substrate philosophy, starting with a substrate that is inert from day one.
This sturdy, reliable wallet, it comes to you completely empty and you have to put the cash in yourself. We're talking about materials like standard cool filter sand, children's play sand, natural river gravel, or even black diamond blasting sand.
Inert substrates are incredibly compelling for several reasons. First, the economic advantage is staggering. You can walk into a local hardware store and purchase a 50-pound bag of kiln-dried pool filter sand for roughly the cost of a cup of coffee.
It entirely circumvents the aquarium tax.
Exactly. Second, because they are inert, meaning they are chemically inactive, they will not alter your water parameters, they won't strip your carbonates, they won't lower your pH, and crucially, they will not release a massive wave of toxic ammonia when you flood the tank.
But the drawback is the empty wallet. You have zero nutrients in the grain floor. If you take a heavy root-feeding plant, like a massive Amazon sword or a cryptocoryne, and you plant it in 3 inches of pure washed pool filter sand, what happens?
Well, it might survive on whatever it can scavenge from the water column for a while, but it will eventually stall, stunt, and likely perish.
Right.
When you choose an inert substrate, you're choosing to manually manage the nutrient payload from day one. You have to actively insert root tabs concentrated fertilizer capsules deep into the sand bed near the root zones of the plants. You have to rely more heavily on liquid water column fertilization, and you have to deeply understand how the biological waste from your livestock will eventually break down and settle into the sand to feed the plants.
I want to address a very specific fear I hear a lot regarding sand, specifically fine play sand. There is this pervasive myth on forums that fine sand will severely compact over time, essentially turning into concrete, strangling plant roots, and creating these terrifying, black, anaerobic gas pockets of hydrogen sulfide that will suddenly burst and wipe out your entire tank.
Oh, I see that constantly.
How much of that is reality and how much is internet paranoia?
It is largely internet paranoia born from a tiny kernel of truth. The idea that sand turns into concrete underwater is physically false. Water actually acts as a lubricant between the grains. Plant roots are incredibly powerful. They can easily push through fine sand.
And the gas pockets?
As for the anaerobic pockets, yes, in the very deep beds of very fine sand, you can get areas devoid of oxygen where sulfate-reducing bacteria produce hydrogen sulfide gas, which smells like rotten eggs and is highly toxic.
But the idea that a single bubble of this gas floating to the surface is going to instantly kill a 75-gallon tank is exaggerated, right?
Highly exaggerated. It takes a massive, sudden release of hydrogen sulfide in a poorly oxygenated tank to cause a wipeout. And more importantly, the solution to preventing it isn't avoiding sand entirely, it's promoting bioturbation.
Bioturbation, the active mixing of the soil by living organisms.
Exactly. In an ecosystem, the soil isn't static. If you use a sand bed, you integrate animals like Malaysian trumpet snails. They're nocturnal burrowers. They spend their days tunneling through the sand, eating detritus, and constantly aerating the substrate, turning it over micromillimeter by micromillimeter, completely preventing those dead zones from forming.
So we have the expensive active aquasoil and the cheap empty sand. But when you look at the truly elite competitive aquascapes online, the ones with towering dramatic mountains, plunging valleys, and extreme elevation changes, they aren't just pouring 80 pounds of aquasoil into a mound.
Definitely not.
Because, as we established, that would cost a fortune, and honestly, a massive mountain of pure soil would likely just collapse under its own weight over time.
That is the great illusion of professional aquascaping. What you're looking at is rarely a solid mass of substrate. It's an architectural facade built over a highly engineered, invisible foundation. And the primary structural material used by almost every professional to build that foundation is volcanic lava rock.
Literally the same red or black scoria rock you can buy in massive bags at a landscaping yard or use in a gas grill.
The exact same material.
Hmm.
Lava rock is the unsung hero of the planted tank world. It is incredibly lightweight, meaning you can stack massive volumes of it against the glass without risking structural stress on the aquarium seams.
And it's cheap.
Dirt cheap. And structurally, the jagged edges of the rock lock together perfectly. Aquascapers will take large pieces of lava rock or take crushed lava rock and fill small, zippered mesh filter bags, essentially creating aquatic sandbags.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, and they'll use these bags to build the terraced retaining walls, the steep slopes, and the high mountain peaks inside the empty glass box.
It's pure civil engineering. You build the skeletal structure with cheap interlocking rocks, and then you take your expensive Aquasoil, or your sand, and you simply drape a 1 to 2 inch cosmetic and functional layer over the top of the rocks. You achieve the look of a massive soil bank, but you've only used a fraction of the actual product.
Exactly. But the benefits of lava rock go far beyond just saving money on dirt.
This is where the structural engineering perfectly overlaps with biological filtration, isn't it?
Yes, lava rock is inherently vesicular. It was formed by expanding gases and cooling magma, which means it is essentially a rigid sponge made of stone. It is filled with millions of microscopic pores, fissures, and internal tunnels. When you build a massive structure of lava rock beneath your substrate cap, you're providing an almost incalculable amount of surface area for bacteria.
And we aren't just talking about the standard nitrosomonas and nitrobacter that handle the basic ammonia to nitrate conversion, right? We're talking about deeper, more complex biochemical processes.
Yes. The outer surfaces of the lava rock, where oxygenated water flows freely, house those aerobic bacteria that process ammonia into nitrate. But deep inside the microscopic pores of the rock, the oxygen is eventually depleted by the bacteria on the surface. This creates anoxic zones, areas with extremely low, but not completely zero oxygen.
And why do we want low oxygen zones deep inside our rocks?
Because that is where facultative anaerobic bacteria thrive. These specific bacteria still need oxygen to survive, but because there is no free oxygen dissolved in the water deep inside the rock, they are forced to rip the oxygen molecules off the nitrate in your water.
Wow, so they break down the NO3.
Exactly. When they consume the oxygen from the nitrate, what's left behind is nitrogen gas, which simply bubbles harmlessly out of the tank and into the atmosphere.
That is incredible. They're literally performing denitrification. They're completing the nitrogen cycle by permanently removing nitrates from the system entirely naturally. Your structural foundation is actively scrubbing the water chemistry.
It is a phenomenal process. Now, I will caveat that in a typical fast-flowing aquarium, the volume of water passing through those deep anoxic zones is relatively small, so it won't replace your need for water changes entirely. But it is a continuously running supplementary filtration engine operating completely out of sight.
Speaking of running water through the substrate, I really want to pivot to a piece of technology that was universally used in the 1980s and 90s, was completely vilified and abandoned in the 2000s, and is now seeing this fascinating resurgence in advanced setups. The under-gravel filter.
Ah, yes, the comeback kid.
Because if we are talking about turning the substrate into a biological engine, undergravel filtration does that quite literally.
The undergravel filter is a perfect example of a brilliant concept that was ruined by poor application. Historically, people would put these plastic slotted plates at the bottom of the tank, cover them with enormous, chunky neon pink gravel, and use air stones to pull water down through the rocks.
Right, and it was a mess.
A total mess. All the solid fish waste and uneaten food got sucked down into the plates, rotted, and crashed the tank.
So why are people bringing them back now? What changed?
Because we understand fluid dynamics and mechanical preciltration better now. Today, aquarists will place the undergravel grid down, but instead of raw gravel, they will cover it with a layer of coarse filter sponge, then a thick layer of a highly porous inert substrate, like crushed lava rock or a specific fired clay, like cesium fluorite.
Okay, so much better media.
Exactly. Then, instead of air stones, they attach powerful water pumps to slowly pull oxygenated water down through the entire substrate bed.
It turns the entire floor of the aquarium into a massive, highly oxygenated aerobic biological filter.
It completely eliminates the possibility of anaerobic dead zones. It continuously delivers oxygen to the plant roots, which roots absolutely love, and it ensures a slow, steady flow of water column nutrients directly past the root interface.
That sounds bulletproof.
It is a highly robust, incredibly stable way to run a tank, provided you understand that it's purely an inert system. You cannot run an undergravel filter under a layer of muddy potting soil or aquasoil. You would just pull mud directly into your water pump.
Which provides a perfect contrasting transition, because if pulling water through a highly oxygenated, inert rock bed is one extreme of the spectrum, the complete opposite approach is intentionally sealing a layer of rich, decomposing organic matter beneath an impenetrable cap.
A dirted tank.
Yes, we have to talk about the method popularized by Diana Walstad. We have to talk about the DIY dirted tank.
The dirted tank is the absolute embodiment of the ecosystem approach. It is raw, it is natural, and when done correctly, it is virtually entirely self-sustaining.
Well, let's clarify what we mean by dirt. We aren't talking about going to the backyard and digging up a shovel full of clay. And we certainly aren't talking about premium aquarium soil. We are talking about literal, basic, organic potting soil from the garden center at our local hardware store.
Yes, terrestrial potting soil. The fundamental architecture of a dirted tank involves laying down a relatively thin layer, usually about 1 inch of organic dirt at the very bottom of the glass. Then you meticulously cover, or cap, that dirt with a much thicker layer, usually 1.5 to 2 inches of fine gravel or sand.
The cap is the critical mechanical barrier here. If you just dumped potting soil in a tank and added water, you would create a highly toxic floating black swamp.
Nobody wants that in their living room.
Right. The sand cap physically pins the soil to the bottom, preventing it from leaching massive amounts of tannins and particulate matter into the water column, while still allowing the powerful, sharp tips of the plant roots to punch down through the sand and access the deep nutrient reservoir.
It mimics the exact benthic structure of a natural lake or slow-moving river. You have an anoxic, nutrient-dense organic layer trapped beneath an oxidized mineral layer, and the biochemical magic happening in that trapped dirt layer is just staggering.
What's actually happening down there?
As the organic matter in the soil slowly decomposes, it releases a steady, continuous supply of macronutrients, micronutrients, and critically, a localized source of carbon dioxide right at the root zone.
But I have to throw a massive warning flag up here for anyone thinking about driving to the hardware store today. You cannot simply grab any bag of dirt off the pallet.
No, you really can't.
The specific chemical composition of terrestrial potting soil can be lethal in an aquatic environment if you choose incorrectly. What are the absolute deal breakers when selecting soil?
You must become an obsessive label reader, number 1. Avoid absolutely anything that advertises added chemical fertilizers, like Miracle-Gro Standard Line.
Right.
Those chemical salts will dissolve immediately upon submersion, blast through your sand cap, and create an unrecoverable toxic environment. You're looking for plain, basic, organic potting soil.
And you have to watch out for the physical additives, too. Some brands mix in those moisture-retaining hydrogel crystals to help people who forget to water their houseplants.
Oh, those are disastrous in an aquarium. When those crystals are permanently submerged, they swell exponentially. They will literally expand until they violently burst through your sand cap, looking like little gelatinous alien eggs, ruining the physical barrier of your substrate.
No expanding jelly monsters. Got it.
Yeah.
What about the organic components? I see a lot of organic soils boasting about being fortified with cow or poultry manure.
Avoid manure entirely. The nitrogen content in manure is far too volatile for a closed aquatic system. It will break down rapidly and release an overwhelming spike of ammonia that will suffocate your livestock and trigger massive algae blooms.
That makes sense.
You also need to actively scan the ingredients for any mention of added copper or compost blends that might be high in heavy metals. While plants utilize copper in microscopic trace amounts, it is highly toxic to aquatic invertebrates. If you use a copper-heavy soil, any shrimp or ornamental snails you add to the tank will die almost immediately.
Okay, so I've navigated the hardware store minefield. I have a bag of clean, cheap, plain organic topsoil or potting mix. Do I just dump it in the tank?
Not without processing it first. Terrestrial soil is full of large organic debris wood chips, chunks of bark, large pieces of perlite. You must sift the soil first. Take a garden riddle or a piece of wire mesh and physically sift out all the large woody material.
Why is the wood so dangerous? Wood eventually sinks in an aquarium, right? We use driftwood all the time.
Driftwood is dense, aged heartwood. The shredded bark and sapwood chips in potting soil will rapidly decompose and rot anaerobically under your sand cap. As they rot, they produce massive amounts of methane and hydrogen sulfide gas.
Oh, back to the gas bubbles.
Exactly. Those gas bubbles will build up until they forcefully erupt upward, violently blowing a hole right through your sand cap and spewing raw, rotting mud into your pristine water column. By sifting out the large organics, you ensure a smooth, stable, uniform breakdown of the soil over years, rather than weeks.
Okay, that makes perfect mechanical sense. Sift the dirt, put an inch of the fine, sifted soil in the empty tank. And then how do we get the cap on without making a mess? Because if I pour heavy, dry sand onto dry dirt, it's just going to mix.
This is a crucial procedural step. Once the dry, sifted dirt is in the tank, you must carefully hydrate it before adding the cap. Take a spray bottle and mist the dirt thoroughly.
Like soaking it.
No, you don't want standing puddles of water. You don't want mud soup, but you want the dirt to be uniformly damp, like a freshly wrung out sponge. The moisture binds the dust particles together and creates surface tension. Once the dirt is locked down by the moisture, you gently and methodically layer your 2 inches of washed sand over the top, ensuring every single millimeter of the dirt is completely sealed beneath the cap. Only then do you slowly, carefully flood the tank with water.
But here's where I have to push back on the dirted tank methodology. It sounds beautiful, it sounds deeply natural, but it also sounds like a permanent, irreversible commitment.
It kind of is.
Right. What happens a year down the line? I have this massive, thriving Amazon sword plant. Its root system is deeply entangled in that rich dirt layer. And I decide, for aesthetic reasons, that I want to move that plant 6 inches to the left. If I grab the base of that plant and heave it out of the substrate, what is going to happen?
You are going to trigger an absolute disaster. You will pull a massive, tangled root ball completely saturated with wet, black, nutrient-dense mud violently up through your pristine sand cap.
A mud volcano.
A complete mud volcano. You will instantly release a massive cloud of trapped organics and localized ammonia directly into the water column. The water will turn black, the nutrient spike will be instantaneous, and you will almost certainly trigger a severe algae bloom, if not an outright crash of your water parameters.
So a dirted tank is not for the restless aquascaper.
Precisely. Disturbance is the mortal enemy of the dirted tank. This methodology thrives in highly stable, low-intervention environments. If you're the type of hobbyist who likes to constantly prune, uproot, and rearrange your aquascape every other month, a dirted tank will cause you nothing but misery.
You're better off with sand and root tabs then.
Far better off. The dirted tank is for the patient observer who wants to plant a jungle, step back, and let nature take the wheel for the next 5 years.
But whether you are using a dirted tank that slowly mineralizes over half a decade, or you're using premium Aquasoil, or you're manually pushing root tabs into pool filter sand, we inevitably hit the wall of thermodynamics.
The nutrients run out.
Yes, the nutrients in that closed system will eventually be consumed and incorporated into the cellular mass of the growing plants. The reservoir will eventually run low. And this forces us to cross the threshold into what I believe is the most misunderstood, anxiety-inducing topic in the entire hobby: fertilization.
It induces anxiety because it is, at its core, applied chemistry. And when you start looking at bottles with chemical symbols and concentration percentages, it feels intimidating. But the underlying biological mechanisms are actually quite elegant and accessible once you break them down.
Let's break them down. Let's look at the actual dietary requirements of an aquatic plant. Because I think a lot of people just view fertilizer as a monolithic, magical growth juice. But plants require specific elements for incredibly specific physiological functions. We broadly categorize these into 2 groups: macronutrients and micronutrients. Let's tackle the heavy hitters first. The macros, the NPK.
NPK stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are the elements that the plant requires in massive continuous quantities because they literally form the structural and metabolic architecture of the organism.
Let's start with nitrogen. In an aquarium, this usually takes the form of nitrate, which is the end product of our biological filtration. Why does a plant need so much nitrogen? What is it actually building with it?
Nitrogen is the fundamental building block of amino acids, which are the precursors to all proteins. But most critically for a plant, nitrogen is a core component of the chlorophyll molecule, the green pigment essential for photosynthesis. Furthermore, it is required to synthesize an enzyme called rubisco, which is arguably the most abundant and important protein on Earth, as it is the enzyme responsible for pulling carbon out of the environment to build sugars. Without abundant nitrogen, the plant cannot build the machinery required to harness light. Growth simply halts.
And phosphorus, usually listed on the bottle as phosphate. We see phosphorus blamed for algae blooms all the time, but why does the plant demand it?
Phosphorus is the currency of cellular energy. It is the P in ATP adenosine triphosphate, the molecule that transports chemical energy within cells for metabolism. It's also the structural backbone of DNA and RNA. Without phosphorus, cell division is impossible, and root development completely stalls.
That leaves the K, potassium. Now, potassium is fascinating because, unlike nitrogen and phosphorus, we rarely get potassium naturally accumulating in an aquarium from fish waste. You almost always have to add it. But what is it doing? Because it's not physically building the structure, right?
Correct. Potassium doesn't become part of the physical plant tissue. Instead, it remains dissolved in the plant's cellular fluids, where it acts as a critical metabolic regulator. It is heavily involved in osmoregulation, the balance of water within the plant.
So it keeps the water pressure right.
Yes, it activates over 80 different enzymes responsible for growth. And crucially, it regulates the opening and closing of the stomata, the microscopic pores on the leaves that control gas exchange. If a plant is deficient in potassium, you'll often see tiny pinholes developing in the older leaves as the cellular structure simply breaks down due to unregulated fluid pressure.
So that is the NPK trifecta, the structural lumber, the energy currency, and the metabolic regulator. But then we have the micronutrients, the trace elements. These are elements the plant needs in microscopic, almost imperceptible amounts. But if they are missing, the entire system crashes. We're talking about magnesium, manganese, zinc, boron, and the big one, iron.
Iron is the superstar of the micronutrients, and it perfectly illustrates the concept of biological bottlenecks. While iron isn't physically part of the chlorophyll molecule like nitrogen is, it is absolutely required as a catalyst for the synthesis of chlorophyll.
So without iron, no grain.
Exactly. It's a key component of ferredoxin, an electron transfer protein essential for photosynthesis. If iron is depleted, the new leaves will emerge completely white or pale yellow, a condition known as iron chlorosis, because the plant physically lacks the catalyst to manufacture green pigment.
Which brings me to the absolute holy grail of the modern planted tank hobby, the obsession with deep, vibrant, intensely red plants. You go on Instagram and you see these striking Crimson Rotala macrandra or Ludwigia super red dominating the aquascape, and the immediate assumption every beginner makes is, I need to dump a massive bottle of pure iron into my tank to paint the plants red.
Yep, the classic more iron equals more red myth.
But the mechanism of red coloration is vastly more complex than that, isn't it?
It is. The mechanism of red coloration in aquatic plants is one of the most fascinating intersections of biochemistry and stress adaptation. The red color does not come from iron itself. The red coloration comes from pigments called anthocyanins.
Anthocyanins,
Yeah,
which from a biological standpoint are essentially a chemical defense mechanism. Right?
exactly. Anthocyanins serve as a photoprotective mechanism. They're essentially a chemical parasol that the plant deploys to protect its delicate photosynthetic machinery from photoinhibition. When you expose a plant to extremely high-intensity lighting, high PAR, the plant absorbs more photons than it can safely process.
So it's getting sunburned, basically.
Pretty much. This excess energy can create free radicals that destroy the chloroplasts. To protect itself, the plant synthesizes anthocyanins, which absorb the excess light energy and reflect back the red wavelengths we see.
But here is where the fertilizer balance comes in. If you just blast the plant with highlight, but you also provide an unlimited, abundant supply of nitrogen, the plant doesn't turn red. Why?
Because if nitrogen is abundant, the plant will use that nitrogen to rapidly synthesize more chlorophyll. The green chlorophyll density becomes so high that it visually overpowers and masks any red anthocyanins being produced. Furthermore, the plant uses the excess light energy to fuel rapid upward vegetative growth. It grows toward the surface as fast as possible.
So to achieve those deep competition-level reds, you have to intentionally manipulate the biological bottleneck. You have to induce a state of controlled stress through nitrogen limitation.
Precisely. If you maintain high-intensity lighting and ensure iron is available as a catalyst, but you deliberately limit the concentration of nitrates in the water column, the plant's biology shifts. Without abundant nitrogen, it cannot produce massive amounts of chlorophyll. As the green pigment fades, the red anthocyanins are unmasked.
And it stops growing so fast.
Right. Simultaneously, because the plant cannot grow rapidly upwards without nitrogen, it stalls its vertical growth and focuses its energy on producing more anthocyanins to protect its existing tissues from the intense light it cannot fully utilize.
You are intentionally starving the plant just enough to stall its vegetative growth and force it to deploy its red parasols, while keeping it healthy enough to survive. That is a razor-thin biological tightrope to walk.
It is an incredibly advanced technique, and it perfectly illustrates why blindly dumping all-in-one liquid fertilizer into a tank rarely results in the specific aesthetic outcome the hobbyist wants. You have to understand the mechanism of the organism.
You have to understand the physical anatomy of how different plants actually consume these nutrients, because the delivery method matters just as much as the chemical composition. We have to draw a hard line between root feeders and water column feeders.
The anatomical differences dictate your entire fertilization strategy. Root feeders are plants that have evolved massive, complex, deep-reaching root networks designed to extract nutrients from the anaerobic and aerobic zones of the substrate. We're talking about species like the massive Amazon swords, the vast family of cryptocornines, spreading vallisneria, and bulb plants like the tiger lotus.
Right. So if you take a heavy root feeder, like an Amazon sword, and you plant it in deeply washed, sterile pool filter sand, and then you pour premium liquid fertilizer into the water column every day, what happens to the plant?
It will slowly starve to death. While the leaves can absorb a marginal amount of nutrients from the water column, the plant's metabolic architecture is heavily biased toward root uptake. It physically cannot absorb enough nutrients through its leaf cuticle to sustain its massive structure.
So what do you do?
For these plants, you must utilize root tabs. You have to physically push concentrated capsules of NPK and trace minerals deep into the substrate, directly adjacent to the root mass, creating a highly localized, nutrient-dense zone that only the plant can access.
It's like a targeted care package delivered straight to the plant's front door. But then we have the completely divergent evolutionary path, the epiphytes and the true column feeders.
Epiphytes are species like Anubias, Java fern, Bucephalandra, and the various aquatic mosses. In their natural habitats, these plants do not grow buried in the soil. They grow anchored to submerged rocks, driftwood, or the banks of fast-flowing streams. Their roots serve primarily as mechanical anchors, gripping the hardscape like grappling hooks.
Because they aren't buried in the soil pantry, they have evolved the ability to pull their entire metabolic payload straight out of the water flowing past them, like an atmospheric mist that everyone in the room breathes in.
Exactly. They absorb nutrients directly through their leaves and their exposed rhizomes. If you bury the rhizome of an Anubias deep in the substrate, it will literally suffocate, rot, and die. For epiphytes and fast-growing stem plants that develop aerial roots, liquid fertilizers dosed directly into the water column are absolutely essential. The entire water mass becomes the nutrient reservoir.
So understanding whether you're feeding the soil or feeding the water is step one. For a beginner with a low-tech tank, a simple weekly pump of a balanced all-in-one liquid fertilizer and a few root tabs is usually perfectly sufficient. The growth is slow, the metabolism is relaxed, but the hobby has an extreme, high-octane side. What happens when an aquarist decides they want to push the biological limits of plant growth to the absolute maximum?
That decision shifts you entirely out of the natural, low-tech paradigm and into the highly engineered world of high-tech aquariums. And the driving philosophy of the high-tech world is a fertilization methodology pioneered by Tom Barr, known as the estimative index, or EI dosing.
Let's unpack Tom Barr's estimative index because it completely flips traditional aquarium advice on its head. Historically, aquarists were taught to be terrified of nutrients. We tested the water obsessively, trying to keep nitrates and phosphates as close to zero as possible to prevent algae.
The estimative index operates on the exact opposite principle, the concept of non-limiting nutrients. The theory is based on Liebig's law of the minimum, which states that growth is dictated not by total resources available, but by the scarcest resource.
Meaning whatever runs out first limits everything else.
Exactly. Tom Barr's methodology dictates that you should intentionally flood the water column with an overwhelming surplus of every single macro and micronutrient. You dose massive amounts of potassium nitrate, monopotassium phosphate, and complex trace elements throughout the week.
The goal is to ensure that a lack of fertilizer is never the biological bottleneck. You are providing a bottomless, all-you-can-eat buffet. But logically, my alarm bells are ringing here. If I dump massive amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus into the water, and we just established that free-floating nutrients cause algae, why doesn't an EI-dose tank instantly turn into a solid green block of algae?
Because in an EI system, you artificially alter the metabolic rate of the plants to ensure they outcompete the algae for that food. And the way you turbocharge the plant's metabolism is by manipulating the two other points of the growth triangle, light intensity and carbon saturation.
Let's talk about carbon, because this is the great divider between low-tech and high-tech. When we say carbon, we are specifically talking about dissolved carbon dioxide gas CO2, which is the foundational element required for photosynthesis.
Right. In a low-tech tank, the plants rely on ambient CO2. They get a very small, slow trickle of CO2 from the respiration of the fish and bacteria and from the atmospheric gas exchange happening at the surface of the water. The low availability of carbon fundamentally limits how fast the plant can grow, regardless of how much light or fertilizer you provide.
But in a high-tech EI tank, we bypass nature completely. Hobbyists use pressurized gas cylinders, regulators, and diffusers to actively inject pure CO2 gas directly into the water column, forcing the dissolved carbon levels exponentially higher than they could ever reach naturally.
And the biochemical reaction to that is explosive. When you saturate the water with CO2 and you pair that with high-intensity lighting, the Rubisco enzyme kicks into overdrive. The photosynthetic machinery of the plant accelerates to its absolute biological limit.
They just start eating everything.
Everything. The plants begin metabolizing and consuming the massive surplus of EI-dosed nutrients at an astonishing rate. They grow so fast that they visually pearl-producing oxygen bubbles faster than they can dissolve into the water. Because the plant mass is growing so aggressively, they completely dominate the environment, leaving the algae with no foothold to establish itself, despite the massive presence of nutrients.
It is an engineered metabolic arms race. But even with explosive growth, the plants can't possibly eat 100% of the massive chemical payload you are dumping in every week. There has to be an accumulation of unused salts.
There is. And that is the critical safety valve of the estimative index method.
Yeah.
To prevent the unused fertilizers from accumulating to toxic levels over time, the methodology strictly requires a massive, non-negotiable 50% water change at the end of every single week.
That's a lot of water.
It is. The water change acts as a hard system reset. You flush out the residual buildup, return the parameters to baseline, and begin the massive dosing cycle all over again.
It is a fascinating, highly invective, but incredibly labor-intensive way to run a tank. And because you're dosing such massive quantities of fertilizer, buying tiny, premium bottles of pre-mixed liquid ferts would bankrupt you in a month. So high-tech hobbyists essentially become amateur chemists.
Absolutely. The EI method almost universally relies on DIY fertilizers. Hobbyists purchase the raw, dry agricultural salts in bulk bags of potassium nitrate, Plantex CSM plus B for trace minerals, and they use precise digital scales to mix their own highly concentrated liquid solutions using reverse osmosis water. Or they dry dose the powders directly into the tank.
I've even seen the DIY ethos applied to the substrate. Hobbyists making their own root tabs by packing mineralized clay powders or even slow-release terrestrial plant pellets like Osmocote into empty pharmaceutical gel capsules and pushing them into the sand.
Which is incredibly resourceful, though I always caution people regarding terrestrial slow-release pellets.
Why is that?
The polymer coatings on terrestrial fertilizers are designed to degrade slowly in the fluctuating moisture of soil. When you permanently submerge them in an aquarium, the osmotic pressure can cause those capsules to burst prematurely, dumping a massive, lethal load of ammonia directly into the root zone. It requires careful observation.
Observation is the key word there, because whether you are running a high-tech CO2-injected EI system or a low-tech dirted tank, the ecosystem will constantly provide visual feedback. And this brings us to the most frustrating diagnostic phase of the hobby. Let's talk about the warning signs of imbalance.
The most common failure state is the appearance of algae, and the most common diagnostic error is assuming the algae is caused simply by too much fertilizer.
I really want to hammer this point home because it is the biggest paradigm shift for beginners. Algae is not a fertilizer problem. Algae is an ecosystem imbalance problem. Explain the mechanics of that.
It comes back to Liebig's law of the minimum and the triangle of light, carbon, and nutrients. Imagine a beginner who sets up a tank with standard weak LED lighting and no CO2 injection. They look at their plants, decide they want them to grow faster, and dump a triple dose of liquid fertilizer into the water.
They provided the food, but they didn't provide the engine capacity to process it.
Exactly. The plants physically cannot utilize the heavy nutrient load because they do not have the light energy or the carbon necessary to drive the photosynthetic reaction. The plants hit a metabolic traffic jam. They stall. Now, algae is an incredibly primitive, highly adaptable organism. It does not require highlight. It does not require injected CO2.
So it just takes over.
If there are excess nutrients floating in the water that the higher order plants are failing to consume, the algae spores, which are omnipresent in every aquarium, will immediately capitalize on the surplus and bloom exponentially.
By trying to force feed your plants without balancing the system, you're actually just fertilizing the weeds.
Precisely. And the inverse is also true. If you install a massive high-intensity light fixture over a tank, but you don't provide adequate fertilizers or CO2, the plants will try to ramp up their metabolism, they will instantly exhaust the available nutrients, their cellular structure will begin to break down from the photostress, and once again, algae will step in to exploit the failing, dying plant tissue. Balance is everything.
This perfectly segues into the most terrifying visual feedback a beginner can experience: plant melt. We touched on this in the introduction, but we need to explain the cellular mechanism of what is actually happening when a brand new plant turns to mush in a brand new tank, because it usually triggers a disastrous cascade of over-fertilization.
The phenomenon of transition melt is entirely driven by commercial aquaculture practices. The vast majority of aquatic plants sold in the pet trade, cryptocorynes, echinodoris, almost all stem plants are not grown underwater at the commercial farms. They're grown immersed.
Immersed, meaning their roots are in wet soil, but their leaves and stems are growing up in the open air inside highly humid greenhouses. Why do farms do this?
Economics and physics. Plants grow exponentially faster when they have access to infinite atmospheric CO2 and unfiltered sunlight. Growing them immersed also completely eliminates the risk of algae outbreaks ruining the crop and makes shipping vastly easier. But this creates a massive physiological hurdle for the hobbyist.
Because an immersed leaf is structurally entirely different from a submerged leaf.
Fundamentally different. A leaf grown in the air develops a thick, waxy outer layer called a cuticle to prevent the plant from drying out. It develops rigid structural tissue to hold itself upright against gravity. It develops specific stomatal structures to breathe atmospheric gas. When you take that plant, bring it home, and entirely submerge it under 2 feet of aquarium water, it experiences profound physiological shock.
It's like taking a creature with lungs and suddenly forcing it underwater. The thick, waxy cuticle that protected it in the air now acts as a suffocating barrier, preventing it from exchanging dissolved gases with the water.
Exactly. The immersed leaves are physically incapable of functioning underwater. So the plant makes a highly calculated evolutionary survival decision. It initiates a process of programmed cell death apoptosis in the immersed leaves. The plant intentionally breaks down the cellular scaffolding of the old leaves, reabsorbing whatever mobile nutrients and energy it can, and allows the remaining tissue to literally melt away.
The plant is digesting its own useless terrestrial clothing.
Yes, it uses that salvaged energy to desperately push out new, specialized submerged leaves. These aquatic leaves will be much thinner, devoid of the heavy, waxy cuticle, and structurally optimized for pulling dissolved oxygen and CO2 directly from the water column.
So the melting is not a sign of starvation. It is an active, necessary metabolic transition. But what does the uneducated beginner do? They see the plant melting, they panic, they assume the soil is devoid of nutrients, and they start aggressively dumping liquid fertilizer into the tank.
Which is the worst possible action. Think about the metabolic state of that melting plant. It is in shock. It has no functional aquatic leaves yet. Its root system hasn't established. Its nutrient uptake is virtually zero. When you dump heavy fertilizer into the water column at that exact moment, the plant cannot absorb a single drop of it.
Wow, it's like offering a 5-course steak dinner to someone recovering from the flu. They can't process it, and it's just gonna sit there and spoil.
The fertilizer simply sits in the water, perfectly feeding the massive algae outbreak that is about to occur, because the rotting, melting plant tissue is already releasing organic waste that triggers algae spores to bloom.
It is the perfect storm for a tank crash. The solution to transition melt isn't fertilizer. It is patience, stable water parameters, and physically pruning away the melting, rotting leaves to prevent them from fouling the water chemistry while you wait for the new aquatic growth to emerge.
Exactly. This all loops back to our central thesis. You have to understand the biological mechanisms of the system rather than just reacting blindly with products. And that system extends beyond just the plants and the dirt. The livestock you choose to inhabit this glass box are highly active participants in the nutrient cycle and the physical maintenance of the substrate.
Let's talk about that synergy. Let's talk about designing an ecosystem where the animals and the environment actively support each other. Because your choice of substrate dictates what kind of animals you can ethically keep, and the animals you keep dictate how your substrate functions.
The quintessential example of this is the Corydoras catfish. These are arguably the most popular, charismatic, bottom-dwelling fish in the hobby. If you observe a Corydoras in its natural habitat, or in a properly designed tank, it spends 90% of its waking life actively plunging its face into the substrate, sifting the sand through its gills, hunting for microscopic worms and detritus.
And to do that, they have evolved these highly specialized, delicate whiskers on their face called barbels.
And those barbels are not just for show. They are highly sensitive chemosensory organs packed with taste buds and nerve endings. They are the primary way the fish interacts with its world. If a hobbyist builds an aquascape using exposed, raw, crushed lava rock or sharp, jagged commercial gravel and then drops a school of corridors onto it, the results are tragic.
The fish will still instinctively try to sift the substrate, and in doing so, they will continuously abrade and slice their delicate barbels on the sharp rocks.
The barbels will eventually erode completely away, leading to severe secondary bacterial infections. The fish loses its ability to hunt, becomes chronically stressed, and often starves. If you want to keep substrate sifting fish like corridors, geophagus, or certain loaches, you are biologically obligated to provide them with a thick, deep bed of soft, rounded, fine sand. The architecture of the home must match the evolutionary adaptations of the inhabitant.
And when you match them correctly, the inhabitants actively maintain the home. We mentioned Malaysian trumpet snails earlier, acting as the earthworms of the aquarium, continuously turning over the sand bed, preventing anaerobic gas pockets, and pulling organic detritus down into the root zone.
And the fish themselves are the primary fertilizer engine in a balanced, low-tech tank. This is the process of ammonification. As your fish consume food and metabolize it, they excrete waste. That organic waste settles into the substrate, where heterotrophic bacteria break it down into ammonia, and then autotrophic bacteria convert it into nitrites and eventually nitrates.
Which are the exact macronutrients the plant roots are waiting to absorb via cation exchange. The fish are literally manufacturing the fertilizer precisely where the plants need it. In a mature, heavily stocked, heavily planted, low-tech tank, the biological waste from the fish can often provide the entire nitrogen and phosphorus requirement for the plants. You might only ever need to supplement a little bit of potassium and trace iron. The system closes the loop.
That is the zenith of the aquarium hobby. Achieving that delicate, self-sustaining equilibrium where the fish feed the bacteria feed the plants, and the plants actively scrub the water chemistry to protect the fish. But reaching that equilibrium is not a matter of luck. It requires consistent, methodical observation and a deep understanding of your specific parameters. You cannot manage a complex biochemical system by guessing.
Which is exactly why we put so much emphasis on providing the community with analytical tools. We really want to move hobbyists away from blind guessing and toward data-driven ecosystem management. If you go to thetankguide.com, we have built a suite of tools specifically to help you understand these hidden dynamics. For instance, if you're trying to calculate the bioload of your tank to figure out if your fish are producing enough waste to naturally feed your plants, or if you're on the verge of overwhelming your biological filter, our stocking advisor calculates those parameters based on the specific metabolic rates of the species you select.
We even built a dedicated snail stocking advisor, because as we've discussed, invertebrates are the unsung critical cleanup crew that processes the decaying organic matter that would otherwise trigger an algae bloom. Understanding how many scavengers your system can support is vital.
And if you're taking the plunge into setting up a nutrient-dense Aquasoil tank, and you are terrified of navigating that massive initial ammonia spike, our Cycling Coach tool gives you the exact day-by-day biochemical roadmap for establishing your bacterial colony safely. Furthermore, understanding the slow, steady progression of plant growth and nutrient depletion requires a long-term memory that most of us just don't possess.
That is why keeping a physical log is so crucial.
Exactly. Our daily tank journal allows you to track your pH, your KH, your exact fertilizer dosing schedule, and correlate those metrics with visual changes in plant coloration or algae appearance. You begin to see the mechanical cause and effect rather than just random events. And honestly, if you just want to decompress and absorb the beauty of the hobby without the chemistry math, we even have the Life in Balance coloring book, which beautifully illustrates these exact ecosystem interactions.
The goal of all these resources is empowerment. The industry thrives on selling you a new bottle of liquid every time a leaf turns yellow. We want to give you the knowledge to look at that yellow leaf, understand the biological mechanism causing it, and adjust your ecosystem accordingly. Understanding is the only genuine miracle cure in this hobby.
Let's pull all of this complex chemistry, physics, and biology together. We've journeyed through the CEC of clay substrates, the buffering capacity of aquasoil, the anoxic denitrification deep inside lava rock structures, the slow mineralization of dirted tanks, the biochemical mechanisms of fertilizers, the metabolic arms race of EI dosing, and the cellular reality of plant melt. If we distill all of this into one foundational takeaway for the listener, what is it?
The ultimate takeaway is a rejection of the concept of the best. The best substrate is not the one with the highest price tag or the one used by a world champion aquascaper in a heavily sponsored YouTube video. The best substrate and the best fertilization method is the one that perfectly aligns with your specific biological goals, your financial reality, your maintenance tolerance, and the evolutionary requirements of the living creatures you intend to house. It is about understanding how the gears of the closed ecosystem mesh together rather than trying to force a prepackaged product to solve a fundamental imbalance. Build a solid foundation, respect the biological limitations of the organisms, and the ecosystem will invariably thrive.
A perfectly balanced perspective. And before we close out this deep dive, I know you always have a final provocative thought to leave our listeners pondering as they look at their own tanks. What do you have for us today?
I want you to consider the scale of your awareness. As aquarists, we spend an overwhelming amount of our time and anxiety focused on the macro, the chemistry of the water we can test, the physical growth of the leaves we can see, the swimming patterns of the fish we observe. But the undeniable reality of an aquarium is that the vast majority of the biological heavy lifting is happening in a microscopic world that is entirely invisible to you. There's a thriving, complex, silent universe of billions of bacteria, fungal networks, and microscopic life forms living entirely in the dark spaces between the grains of your substrate. They are tirelessly breaking down waste, trading ions, and stabilizing the very environment that keeps your macroorganisms alive. If you dedicate your efforts to protecting and nurturing that invisible soil ecosystem, the soil will naturally take care of the water chemistry, and the water will effortlessly take care of the fish and plants. So as you look at your tank tonight, ask yourself, what is one deliberate choice I can make today to support the invisible half of my aquarium?
The invisible half. That is a profoundly beautiful way to conceptualize the hobby. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive on Tank Guide Life. We hope we've armed you with the knowledge to look past the marketing labels, to understand the incredible biochemistry happening in your living room, and to approach your aquarium not as a sterile project, but as a dynamic, living ecosystem. Stay curious, respect the biology, and embrace the balance. We'll catch you on the next one.